Good morning. It's Sunday, March 15th, 2026, and the Middle East is at an absolute boiling point. The war between Iran and the U.S.-Israeli coalition has been raging for more than 2 weeks now, and things are moving incredibly fast. So here's your essential briefing on what you need to know right now.
Okay, let's just dive right into the timeline, because the last 48 hours have been this brutal tit-for-tat escalation. It really kicked off on Friday when the U.S. bombed Iran's critical Karg Island. Well, Iran's response was swift and it was widespread. A heavy missile barrage slammed into northern Israel, and another missile had to be shot down over Turkey, which, by the way, pulls NATO right into the middle of this. By Saturday, the whole cycle was just spinning out of control. A joint strike hit a factory in Isfahan, and then boom, Iran retaliates again, hitting the U.S. embassy in Baghdad and key airbases and ports in Kuwait and the UAE. You see what's happening? This isn't just a conflict anymore, it's a regional firestorm.
And here's the thing, this raging firestorm, this was not the plan. Not even close. What was supposed to be a quick, decisive operation has completely spiraled into a grinding, high-intensity war that is really testing the limits of everyone involved.
And this slide right here, it just perfectly captures that massive miscalculation. The plan, over on the left, was called Operation Epic Fury. The idea was a so-called decapitation strike, designed to take out Iran's leadership and military command in a single hour. A clean, surgical, first-hour victory. The reality, on the right? Well, it's the total opposite. A bloody, drawn-out war of attrition that's being fought on multiple fronts. And now, analysts are calling this a systemic threat to global stability.
And believe me, they are not exaggerating that threat. This quote from a geopolitical assessment just 2 days ago calls the war a catastrophic miscalculation. But look at that second part. It threatens the foundational structures of Western hegemony. So what does that really mean? It means this isn't just a regional war anymore. It's now being seen as something that could bring an end to the entire global power structure we've known since the Cold War ended.
So how on earth did it spiral out of control so quickly? Well, as we're about to see, the conflict just refused to stay in its box. It is now pulling in nations and proxy forces across the entire Middle East and even beyond.
We're not talking about one front line here. This is a whole web of interconnected conflicts. So you've got the direct strikes between the main players, of course. But on top of that, the war in Lebanon has just exploded. U.S. bases and commercial hubs in nearly every single Gulf state have been hit. NATO, as we said, has been dragged in over Turkish skies. And the fight has even spread all the way to the Indian Ocean, where U.S. submarines sank an Iranian frigate just last week. It's everywhere.
And behind all the military strategy, there is an immense, staggering human cost. This number, 816,000, that's the UN's estimate from just Friday for the number of people displaced in Lebanon alone from Israeli attacks. That's a massive humanitarian crisis unfolding on just one of this war's many, many fronts. So what's the big picture here? Well, this isn't just a military crisis or a humanitarian one. It's a geopolitical shockwave. The entire strategic balance in the region is fundamentally changing, and these long-held assumptions we've had about military power and deterrence, they are being shattered day by day. To really get what's at stake, we have to talk about this one word, hegemony. You know, analysts believe the whole era of singular American military predominance in the region is being violently challenged. Iran's strategy seems laser-focused on proving that the U.S. can no longer guarantee security for its partners in the region. And this leads to the critical question that's now being asked in capitals all across the Gulf. Are U.S. bases actually providing security, or are they just attracting attack? For decades, American bases were seen as a shield, but as Iranian drones and missiles are raining down on those very bases and the cities around them, you've got regional leaders asking if that shield has now become a magnet for violence.
And listen, this isn't some distant conflict. Whether you're in Europe, Asia, or the Americas, the economic shockwaves are already hitting the global economy, and they're hitting your wallet. The main reason? Iran has closed the Strait of Hormuz. Think of that narrow waterway as the world's oil superhighway. A huge chunk of global oil travels through it every day. That single act of economic warfare has sent oil prices skyrocketing past $100 a barrel. And that's after the International Energy Agency released the largest ever amount of strategic reserves to try and stop the bleeding. It's not working. And the fallout from that oil shock, well, it just ripples out into everything. We're seeing soaring prices for fuel and cooking gas. Supply chains for all sorts of goods are being completely disrupted, and that in turn leads to rising costs for food and fertilizer. On top of all that, with widespread airspace closures over the region, global travel is in chaos. All of this is feeding a major risk of wider inflation. So where does this go next? The honest truth is, nobody knows for sure. The information we're getting is contradictory, the situation is dangerously volatile. The fog of war is incredibly thick right now. And the disconnect between the official statements and what's actually happening on the ground is just jarring. On one side, you've got leaders like President Trump declaring victory, saying the war is very complete, with claims that 90% of Iran's military capacity is just gone. But on the other side, you have the reality of the last 48 hours. Ongoing heavy missile strikes on Israel, drone attacks on Gulf states, and ballistic missiles reaching into NATO airspace. The evidence tells a very different story. Iran can still project serious power across the entire region. So here's the bottom line. The world has entered what one analyst called a period of strategic twilight. The old rules are breaking down, and what comes next is terrifyingly unclear. It really leaves us with this final, unsettling question. Are we witnessing the beginning of a wider world war, or are we watching the violent birth of a new global order?
You know, there's this very specific, very primal physical reaction your body has when it suddenly realizes it cannot breathe.
Right.
It doesn't really matter how strong your muscles are or, how sharp your mind is. If the oxygen is cut off, the entire system immediately just shifts into pure survival mode.
Yeah.
The higher brain functions shut down, and the panic response just takes over.
Yeah, the biology of a chokehold is completely unforgiving because it attacks the underlying delivery mechanism of life itself rather than causing, localized trauma.
Exactly.
Ugh.
And this morning, a barrel of crude oil just hit $200.
Wow.
Yeah. Private insurance actuaries just sitting at desks in London have effectively outlawed global commercial shipping in the Middle East. And it all started with a massive bombing raid on an island most people had probably, never even heard of until Friday. So it is Sunday morning, March 15th, 2026. We are looking at a geopolitical chokehold, and the global economy is currently holding its breath.
The face turning blue right now really belongs to the global supply chain. We are entering the third week of a rapidly escalating war between the United States, Israel, and Iran. And the sheer volume of military and economic data we've seen cross the wire over the last 48 hours, it indicates that the scale and really the potential fallout of this conflict have fundamentally altered.
Okay, let's unpack this. We are looking at a massive stack of highly current sources for today's deep dive. Over the weekend, we've been pulling from, YouTube military analysts who have been posting literally hour-by-hour updates.
Right.
We've got on-the-ground journalistic reports, interviews with macroeconomic forecasters, and statements from military experts.
Yeah.
The sheer density of the information is just staggering.
It really is. And processing this volume requires us to carefully separate the signal from the noise, especially because the sources we are utilizing contain highly charged political rhetoric.
Oh, absolutely.
We are seeing intense propaganda, aggressive posturing, and deeply partisan narratives coming from various governments and commentators involved across the spectrum, east and west.
Which is exactly why we need to establish the ground rules for today's deep dive right up front. We are not touching the political rhetoric with a 10-foot pole. We are not taking any sides here.
No, absolutely no.
The mission today is to cut through that fog of war and extract the absolute, verifiable facts of the military and economic movements. When we quote a politician or a military leader, we are analyzing their statement purely as a data point to understand the reality on the ground and the broader implications.
Exactly. Our objective is to impartially report on the data provided in these sources and forecast the most likely scenarios for the evolution of this crisis in the upcoming weeks. We have to look at how these events will ripple outward and affect everything for you, from global alliances to domestic inflation.
So let's start with the immediate catalyst for the chaos over the weekend. The escalation ladder took a massive jump with the unprecedented kinetic exchanges over the last 48 hours.
It really did.
And for anyone following the news who might be a little tired of the military jargon, when analysts use the word kinetic, they basically mean we have moved past economic sanctions, we're past cyber attacks, and past proxy skirmishes.
Right. It's actual combat.
Exactly. We were talking about physical munitions, smart bombs, ballistic missiles, and drone swarms, actually destroying real targets. The rules of engagement have been rewritten basically overnight, and that started at Karg Island.
Yeah, geography really is destiny in this conflict, and Karg Island is the ultimate proof of that axiom. It is this small piece of rock located about 33 kilometers off the coast of Iran, right in the Persian Gulf.
Right.
And to understand its significance, you really have to look at the historical precedent. During the tanker war in the 1980s, Karg was a primary target because of its infrastructure. Today, it handles roughly 90% of Iran's crude oil exports.
90% bottlenecking through one tiny island. I mean, we are talking about the capacity to process 950 million barrels annually. It is the absolute central nervous system for a nation that relies desperately on those energy revenues to keep its domestic economy functioning under heavy global sanctions. And the United States military just targeted it.
They did. U.S. President Donald Trump released a detailed statement regarding the strike, and he categorized it as one of the most powerful bombing raids in Middle East history.
Wow.
Based on the damage assessments in the sources, the U.S. focused on blinding and paralyzing the island. They targeted the air defenses, the radar installations, and the military command centers dotting the facility.
But there was a very specific caveat in that statement, which reveals a fascinating strategic calculation. The president explicitly ordered the military not to destroy the oil infrastructure itself. He left the actual crude storage tanks and loading terminals alone. He basically framed the strike as a warning shot, essentially communicating, we have the conventional firepower to obliterate your economy overnight, but we are holding off for now on the condition that you reopen the Strait of Hormuz.
The administration is attempting an incredibly precarious balancing act here. They want to systematically degrade Iran's military capabilities without triggering an immediate, catastrophic collapse of the global oil market. Destroying Karg's oil terminals would instantly vaporize millions of barrels of oil from the global daily supply, sending shockwaves through every Western economy.
But here's where it gets really interesting, though. If you bomb the air defenses surrounding an oil facility, but purposefully leave the oil intact, aren't you essentially daring the adversary to respond symmetrically?
It definitely looks that way.
It's like a high-stakes game of chicken, where you are signaling that oil infrastructure is now officially in play, which almost guarantees they will turn around and set fire to your allies' oil out of spite.
And symmetrical retaliation is precisely what the sources show Iran executed. While Iranian state media officially reported no damage to their oil facilities on Karg,
which aligns with the U.S. statement, right?
Exactly. It aligns perfectly regarding the target selection. But Iran did not simply absorb the military strike. They launched a highly calculated response aimed at U.S. and allied assets in the region, focusing meticulously on logistics, diplomacy, and allied energy.
Let's walk through the mechanics of that retaliation. First, they struck the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad. This isn't just some small diplomatic outpost. The Baghdad embassy compound is heavily fortified.
It's massive.
But Iranian drones managed to penetrate the airspace and strike the compound, causing visible fires.
The embassy strike is psychological, and it's symbolic. It demonstrates that hardened diplomatic fortresses are permeable. But the more strategically damaging strikes occurred in Saudi Arabia. They targeted the Prince Sultan Air Base, specifically hitting 5 U.S. Air Force KC-135 Stratotankers.
Right, taking out 5 refueling planes on the ground feels like a massive strategic shift.
Yeah.
I mean, if we look at the operational math of modern aerial warfare, why is hitting a tanker so much more devastating than hitting a fighter jet?
Well, because modern fighter jets like the F-35 or the F-15 are essentially highly advanced sensor platforms strapped to massive engines.
Right.
They consume fuel at an astonishing rate, especially when carrying heavy payloads of munitions or operating in stealth configurations where they cannot carry external drop tanks. They rely entirely on airborne refueling from those KC-135s to loiter in combat zones, to patrol contested skies, and to execute long-range strike missions.
So without those flying gas stations, the operational radius of the U.S. Air Force physically shrinks. An F-35 might have to fly directly from its base, drop its payload, and immediately return home without having the time to hunt for dynamic targets or provide sustained air cover.
Exactly. It degrades the U.S. military's ability to maintain a continuous, suffocating presence over the airspace. By destroying 5 tankers, Iran removed hundreds of hours of potential combat air patrols from the board. It is a very deliberate strike against the underlying logistics of American power projection. And they applied that exact same logistical targeting to the Allied oil sector.
Right, because the U.S. spared the oil on Karg. Iran responded by targeting the oil infrastructure of U.S. allies. They launched kinetic strikes against oil tankers at the United Arab Emirates ports of Fujairah and Sharjah.
Yes.
The message is brutally mathematical. They're basically saying, if you threaten our ability to export oil by blowing up our defenses, we will systematically dismantle the energy infrastructure of your allies, and we will cripple the logistics of your military.
It is the purest form of asymmetric warfare mirroring conventional targets. And the human cost is mounting. During these operations, a U.S. KC-135 crashed over western Iraq, killing all 6 crew members on board. Yeah. This brings the official U.S. military death toll in this specific 3-week conflict to 13, with approximately 200 service members injured.
And some of the analysts in our sources are speculating that the casualty numbers could be higher, given the sheer volume of strikes on bases across the region where medical evacuations might still be ongoing. But 13 is the confirmed data point right now.
Which brings us to the immediate forecast based on these kinetic movements. The U.S. is signaling further escalation. The sources report the deployment of a U.S. Marine Expeditionary Unit, roughly 5,000 Marines and sailors, heading directly into the Persian Gulf.
5,000 Marines floating off the coast isn't just a localized security detail. That is the architecture of an amphibious invasion force.
Right. Which is the primary debate among military forecasters today. Are we looking at the logistical prelude to a ground invasion?
It's a huge question.
The U.S. might be positioning forces to physically seize Karg Island or to secure key coastal batteries along the Iranian shoreline in a desperate attempt to forcefully reopen the Strait of Hormuz in the coming weeks. If 5,000 Marines make landfall, the escalation ladder ceases to have rungs. We would be transitioning from an air and naval standoff into a full-scale theater war involving ground troops in highly hostile terrain.
And the only reason a ground invasion is even being entertained as a viable option is because of the economic strangulation happening right now. The bombs and drones are hitting military bases and oil terminals, but the shockwave from those explosions has triggered a terrifying economic paralysis of the world's most vital maritime artery.
Yes, absolutely.
Because the U.S. and Israel are currently trapped in this fog of war, completely unable to guarantee maritime security, global shipping has essentially surrendered. This fundamentally rewrites the global economy overnight.
We really have to examine the mechanism of this chokehold, because the Strait of Hormuz is effectively closed, but not by a physical wall of warships. It is a paper blockade.
Right. The sources note that Lloyd's of London, the absolute epicenter of global maritime insurance, has completely refused to issue insurance or reinsurance for commercial vessels attempting to transit the region. And this is where the geopolitical abstraction becomes a kitchen table reality for you, the listener.
To understand the power of a paper blockade, we have to look at how maritime insurance actuaries calculate risk. A modern crude oil tanker is a $200 million floating asset, and it's often carrying another $100 million worth of cargo.
Insane amounts of money.
Exactly. No single shipping company holds that risk alone. It is distributed across a massive web of syndicates and reinsurers.
Which means you could have an entire U.S. Navy carrier strike group offering to escort a massive oil tanker through the strait. They could surround that tanker with Arleigh Burke-class destroyers and provide an umbrella of F-35 air cover. But if a private actuary sitting at a desk in London runs the math and decides that the risk of a single $1,000 Iranian drone slipping through the defensive net and hitting that tanker is statistically too high, the ship does not sail.
Precisely.
The military cannot override the insurance market.
The global supply chain operates strictly on risk mitigation and financial liability. If private insurers will not underwrite the multi-hundred-million-dollar risk of a transit, commercial shipping freezes entirely. Navies can protect ships, but they cannot insure them. And because of that total freeze, the immediate macroeconomic reaction has been violent. Crude oil is surging, pushing rapidly toward $200 a barrel.
Which translates into what economists are calling a war tax right at your local gas pump. In places like Los Angeles, gasoline has hit $8 a gallon.
Wow.
Yeah. But let's look past the initial shock of the number. The real danger isn't just that your commute costs more. It's the macroeconomic drag. When fuel hits $8 a gallon, every single physical good that moves by truck, which is virtually everything you buy, instantly costs more to transport. It breaks the monthly budget of average citizens and drains consumer spending from the rest of the economy.
And fuel prices are really merely the most visible metric of the crisis. What the forecasters are truly panicked about is the hidden systemic inflation baking into the agricultural sector. The Strait of Hormuz is not just a conduit for crude oil. It is a massive artery for the chemicals that keep the modern world fed. 1/3 of global fertilizer commodities pass through that exact same maritime choke point.
This was a massive realization for me in the sources. The baseline cost of agricultural production relies heavily on the Haber-Bosch process, which requires massive amounts of natural gas to synthesize ammonia for fertilizer. Because the energy market is locked down, fertilizer costs have spiked by 77%.
A 77% increase in the fundamental raw materials of farming is catastrophic. This directly threatens domestic food security across the Western world. Modern crop yields depend entirely on these synthetic inputs.
So a family farmer in Iowa or Nebraska who operates on razor-thin margins and plans their budget seasons in advance is suddenly finding themselves entirely priced out of production. They literally cannot afford to plant the corn and the wheat that feeds the country.
Right. The cascading effect is terrifying. A drone hits a port in Fujairah, maritime insurance is canceled in London, a farmer in Nebraska scales back planting, and 6 months from now, the price of a box of cereal or a loaf of bread doubles for a family in Ohio.
It exposes the absolute fragility of the globalized supply chain. And this disruption isn't limited to maritime transit either. We are seeing severe operational math breakdowns in the aviation sector as well.
Right, because the airspace over Iraq, Syria, and Iran is effectively a hot war zone, commercial aviation routes are being massively redrawn. Dubai and Sharjah airports, which serve as two of the most critical transit hubs connecting East and West, are facing total suspensions of flight operations due to the persistent threat of drone strikes.
The sources mentioned major airlines such as Indigo and Air India being forced to impose massive fuel surcharges on tickets just to remain solvent. When you close the airspace over the Middle East, a flight from London to Singapore has to reroute thousands of miles out of its way, which introduces a brutal payload versus fuel trade-off. If a plane has to fly 4 extra hours to safely bypass the war zone, it has to carry thousands of extra pounds of highly expensive jet fuel. To accommodate that fuel weight, they have to offload cargo or reduce passenger numbers, which just destroys the profitability of the route.
If we forecast this macroeconomic scenario out over the coming months, the outlook provided by geopolitical analysts is incredibly grim. If the Strait of Hormuz remains closed, we are not just looking at a mild recession to cool inflation.
Not at all.
Experts are warning of a cascading economic crisis that could devolve into a global depression, potentially rivaling or exceeding the crash of 1929. The modern, just-in-time delivery world is simply too interconnected and too heavily reliant on that specific choke point to survive a prolonged closure without systemic financial failure.
The pressure cooker is reaching a critical threshold. You have military casualties mounting, the global economy staring down the barrel of the depression, and the cost of basic living skyrocketing. When governments face this level of intense existential domestic pressure, truth and transparency are usually the first casualties.
Definitely.
This leads us to the bizarre landscape of information control, psychological warfare, and the leadership vacuums we are seeing across all sides of this conflict.
In any prolonged conflict, controlling the domestic narrative becomes just as critical to survival as controlling the physical battlefield. But the level of information warfare we are seeing documented in the sources right now is extraordinary, even by modern standards. Let's examine the rhetoric coming from the United States leadership.
The language is highly aggressive and historically loaded. U.S. Secretary of War Pete Hegseth recently gave a statement referring to Iranian leaders as rats in hiding. But beyond the dehumanizing rhetoric, he openly demanded what he explicitly called a patriotic press. He suggested that the media needs to actively rewrite headlines and censor unfavorable narratives about the lack of military progress or the economic fallout.
The demand for a press corps that aligns fully with the administration's strategic narrative reveals deep internal anxieties.
But is Hegseth actually serious about expecting the media to censor themselves? Or is this primarily domestic political theater designed to appease a specific base and set up a scapegoat if the war goes poorly? Because the contradiction here is glaring. While Hegseth is demanding press compliance, President Trump is concurrently claiming that the military is way ahead of schedule and that Iran's military infrastructure is virtually eradicated.
The contradiction is exactly what political commentators are analyzing. If a nation is achieving overwhelming, scheduled military victories, the leadership generally invites press coverage to document the success.
Right, they want to show it off.
Exactly. The demand for a patriotic press usually surfaces when the reality on the ground diverges sharply from the promised outcome.
It feels like the audience is being asked to ignore their own eyes. We are told the enemy is obliterated, yet the administration is simultaneously begging the press to stop reporting bad news. And the U.S. is offering $10 million bounties for the location of Iranian leaders who are supposedly already neutralized.
It's a massive disconnect.
As the $8 gas continues to drain citizens' bank accounts, the administration clearly knows that public tolerance for an undeclared, unauthorized war will evaporate unless they can completely control the story.
The weaponization of information isn't limited to the U.S. either. The psychological warfare surrounding Israel's leadership is even more complex.
Let's delve into the wild speculation surrounding Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Sources pointed to an official video recently released by the Prime Minister's office intended to show him actively managing the crisis. But internet sleuths and digital analysts immediately noticed a grotesque anomaly in the footage. In certain frames, Netanyahu appeared to have 6 fingers on one hand.
Right, a classic artifact of generative artificial intelligence. The presence of such a glaring digital error strongly suggests the video was either entirely AI-generated or heavily manipulated.
Which introduces a terrifying new dynamic into statecraft. This anomaly poured gasoline on rumors, which were instantly and eagerly amplified by Iranian state media that Netanyahu is either severely incapacitated following a strike or possibly dead.
And we must look at the context surrounding the video release. These rumors spiked dramatically because a highly publicized, high-level diplomatic visit from U.S. envoys Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff was abruptly canceled at the very last minute.
You don't cancel a visit from the U.S. president's inner circle unless the situation on the ground has deteriorated catastrophically or the person they're supposed to meet is physically unavailable.
Exactly. Whether Netanyahu is actually incapacitated, or if he is simply sequestered in a deep, secure bunker for operational safety, the perception of a leadership vacuum is incredibly damaging. It demonstrates how AI and digital manipulation are being actively weaponized to demoralize an enemy's public. If you can inject enough doubt into the Israeli populace to convince them that their government is faking the survival of their leader, you sow mass panic, distrust, and internal division during a critical military campaign.
Meanwhile, in Iran, they didn't have a rumored change in leadership. They had a highly public one. Following the death of Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei in the earlier stages of the conflict, his son, Mojtaba Khamenei, has been officially appointed as the new Supreme Leader.
Any diplomatic hopes from Western forecasters that a new leader might utilize the transition to seek an off-ramp or negotiate a ceasefire were immediately dashed. Mojtaba Khamenei's first public address was uncompromising. He officially ordered the continued total blockade of the Strait of Hormuz, and he escalated the diplomatic stakes by demanding that neighboring Gulf countries immediately close all American military bases on their soil.
Which perfectly explains the intelligence war happening in the shadows.
Mm-hmm.
The U.S. is offering these massive $10 million rewards for actionable intelligence on key Iranian leaders like Mojtaba Khamenei and top Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps commanders.
Right.
But the other side is playing the exact same game. Iraqi resistance factions, heavily aligned with Iran, are offering 150 million Iraqi dinars for the capture or identification of U.S. military and intelligence personnel.
The specific wording of the Iraqi faction's bounty is critical here. They noted they are hunting for U.S. personnel operating in civilian disguises. Yeah. This signifies a shift towards a highly decentralized, shadowy phase of the conflict. It is an urban intelligence war happening in the streets of Baghdad and Erbil, moving away from conventional battlefields.
Let's forecast the mechanics of this decapitation strategy because both sides seem intent on taking out the other's leadership. What happens if a kinetic strike actually succeeds in wiping out the top tier of the Iranian government or the IRGC command structure without a clear succession plan?
This is where we have to fundamentally understand the architecture of the IRGC. Western military doctrine relies on highly centralized command and control. If you decapitate the central command, the military often ceases to function cohesively. But the IRGC operates more like a franchise model of militancy, or a highly resilient mesh network.
So taking out the leadership in Tehran doesn't cut the head off a snake. It just unplugs the central server of a network where all the local nodes already know exactly what to do.
Precisely. The IRGC has spent decades establishing localized command structures, autonomous funding streams through smuggling and front companies, and communication protocols designed specifically to operate even if Tehran goes completely dark. If the central political leadership falls, the IRGC wouldn't surrender. They would likely fragment into heavily armed, highly motivated regional factions.
They would possess advanced drone stockpiles, ballistic missile batteries, and a religious mandate to seek unending revenge, but there would be no central political authority left to negotiate with.
If that network fragments, negotiating a ceasefire becomes literally impossible. There would be no single authorized figure sitting across a diplomatic table who could actually order the various autonomous factions to stop launching drones at commercial shipping. The war would grind on indefinitely on autopilot.
Which is a terrifying prospect for the rest of the world. Because the vacuum of truth, combined with the sheer economic desperation of losing access to the Strait of Hormuz, is forcing nations all over the globe to realize they have to fend for themselves. This panic is completely rewriting global alliances overnight, leading to deeply hypocritical compromises just to survive the fallout.
The shifting geopolitical alliances are perhaps the most fascinating long-term outcome of this three-week war. The U.S. and Israel's inability to guarantee maritime security is forcing an unprecedented global realignment. Let's analyze what macroeconomic forecasters are calling the Russian paradox.
The mechanics of this paradox are almost unbelievable. The U.S. administration's primary global strategic goal for the last several years has been to isolate Russia economically due to the conflict in Ukraine.
Right.
The primary weapon in that economic war was sanctioning Russian oil exports to starve Vladimir Putin's war machine of capital.
But the global commodities market is entirely fungible. Because the Iranian oil is offline and the Strait of Hormuz is functionally closed to Western shipping, the global energy market is facing a total supply collapse. To prevent a domestic economic depression and lower that $8 gas price, the U.S. administration has been quietly forced to relax its sanctions on Russian oil.
So if we trace the causality here, to punish Iran, the U.S. disabled the air defenses around Iranian oil infrastructure. This predictable escalation caused Iran to utilize its asymmetric advantage to block the strait, which spiked global oil prices to $200.
Exactly.
And to fix the catastrophic economic damage of their own strike, the U.S. essentially has to permit the world to buy Russian oil again, funneling billions of dollars in fresh cash directly into Russia.
It highlights the extreme limitations of using economic sanctions as a weapon in a fully globalized, highly constrained energy market.
It's like trying to put out a grease fire in your kitchen by flooding your entire house, and somehow the adversary you've been trying to bankrupt across the street ends up getting paid for the water damage restoration. It is a stunning paradox of unintended consequences.
And while the West is struggling to manage this paradox, other nations are successfully navigating the blockade through direct, pragmatic diplomacy with Iran. A prime example highlighted in the sources is India's recent diplomatic maneuvering.
While Western flagships and ships insured by Western syndicates in London are completely paralyzed, India managed to secure safe, unhindered passage for two of its massive LPG, that's liquefied petroleum gas tankers. LPG is absolutely essential for domestic cooking and infrastructure in India. How did they manage to bypass a blockade that the U.S. Navy cannot break?
They bypassed the naval standoff with a phone call. India's External Affairs Minister, S. Jaishankar, engaged in direct bilateral talks with Iran's representative, Abbas Araghchi. Following that diplomatic engagement, Iran specifically cleared those two Indian vessels to sail safely through the closed Strait of Hormuz, completely unmolested by drone swarms or fast attack craft.
So India leverages its diplomatic channels, contacts Tehran, affirms their neutral or friendly status, and their massive energy shipments sail right past the burning Western tankers.
Yes, and this reveals a brilliant, highly calculated strategy by Iran. They are not executing a blind, chaotic blockade. They are weaponizing the supply chain selectively. They are meticulously differentiating the globe, drawing a hard line between hostile Western nations, the U.S., Israel, the U.K., Europe, and neutral or friendly nations like India, China, and Russia.
By allowing Indian and Chinese oil and gas transit to continue, Iran accomplishes two massive strategic goals simultaneously. First, they mitigate their own total economic isolation by maintaining lucrative trade flows with massive Asian markets. Second, they ensure that the agonizing economic pain of the blockade, the $200 oil and the 77% spike in fertilizer, is inflicted almost exclusively on the West.
It is precision-guided economic warfare. And you see smaller nations quietly trying to walk this incredible diplomatic tightrope so they aren't crushed between the superpowers. The sources detailed a recent incident involving Sri Lanka that serves as a perfect microcosm of this balancing act.
A few days ago, the maritime conflict expanded violently when a U.S. submarine torpedoed and sank an Iranian frigate, the Iris Denai, in the Indian Ocean off the coast of Sri Lanka. Sinking a sovereign naval vessel is a massive escalation in itself.
It brings conventional naval warfare right to Sri Lanka's maritime doorstep. But observe how the Sri Lankan government handled the immediate fallout. As a smaller nation, they cannot afford to anger the United States, but they also maintain vital diplomatic and economic relations with Iran.
They quietly orchestrated a strictly humanitarian response to avoid taking a military stance. They coordinated the logistics of repatriating the bodies of 84 dead Iranian sailors back to Tehran, while simultaneously providing medical care and hosting the 32 rescued Iranian survivors on their soil. They are desperately trying to remain neutral caretakers in a superpower war that literally washed up on their beaches.
But remaining a neutral caretaker is becoming increasingly difficult because the chaos is violently spilling over borders globally. The vacuum of American attention is emboldening other regional actors who see that the world's primary superpower is entirely consumed by the Gulf crisis.
The sources map out these spillover conflicts. Pakistan just launched opportunistic airstrikes into Kabul, Afghanistan. Drones of unknown origin have struck critical fuel reserves in Sudan, and the kinetic reality is creeping directly into Europe. NATO and Turkey are actively having to utilize air defense systems to shoot down Iranian ballistic missiles that are violating Turkish airspace on their trajectory toward Israel.
When macroeconomic forecasters and geopolitical analysts connect all these disparate events, the U.S. forced to relax Russian sanctions, India bypassing Washington to deal directly with Tehran, the selective weaponization of the supply chain, and the unchecked regional spillover violence, they arrive at a staggering conclusion. What we are witnessing in real time is the potential collapse of American hegemony in the Middle East.
Let's break down the mechanics of what the collapse of hegemony actually looks like for the countries on the ground. Take the wealthy Gulf states, countries like the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Qatar. For decades, their entire fundamental security doctrine and economic stability were based on an implicit, ironclad guarantee.
The guarantee was transactional. Basically, we will host massive American military bases on our soil. We will price our oil exclusively in U.S. dollars to prop up your currency. And in exchange, the overwhelming might of the United States military will protect our sovereignty and our infrastructure.
But the events of the last 3 weeks have shattered that illusion. What are these states realizing as they watch Iranian drones effortlessly bypass billion-dollar U.S. Patriot missile batteries to set their oil terminals in Fujairah on fire?
They are realizing that hosting an American military base no longer acts as a shield. It acts as a giant, illuminated target. They are seeing empirical proof that conventional U.S. air defense systems cannot reliably protect their sprawling, fragile infrastructure from asymmetric drone swarms.
If we forecast this realization out over the coming weeks and months, the analysts warn that we might see a historic geopolitical realignment. These wealthy Gulf nations may look at the math and decide that the American security umbrella is fundamentally defective. To prevent their glittering economic hubs, cities like Dubai or Doha, from being permanently reduced to ash in a superpower crossfire, they might formally and publicly break their alliances with Washington.
And geopolitics abhors a vacuum. They cannot simply stand alone in a hostile region. If they evict the Americans, they will inevitably seek new ironclad security guarantees from the only other global powers capable of providing them, and more importantly, powers that currently possess diplomatic leverage and working relationships with Iran. They will turn to China or Russia.
Which brings us to the massive overarching stakes of everything we've analyzed today from these sources. We are looking at a terrifying asymmetrical military stalemate. On one side, you have the United States and Israel possessing overwhelming conventional aerial firepower. They can fly sorties and bomb physical targets like Karg Island almost at will.
But conventional military might is proving entirely inadequate against asymmetric economic leverage. Iran doesn't need a fleet of F-35s or a massive blue water navy. They just need enough cheap, expendable drones and sea mines to terrify private insurance actuaries in London. As long as they maintain that threat, they keep their hands firmly wrapped around the throat of the global economy.
And right now, the asymmetric leverage is winning. It is causing immediate, excruciating global pain. This is why the minutiae of these kinetic strikes and diplomatic phone calls matter deeply to you, the listener. The next few weeks are critical. We aren't just waiting to see if a borderline on a map in the Middle East shifts a few miles.
We are waiting to see if the complex, highly optimized global supply chains that sustain modern life permanently fracture. We are watching to see if the severe inflation that destroys savings accounts, bankrupts family farms in the Midwest, and prices families out of basic groceries becomes a permanent, structural fixture of the Western economy.
Which leads us to a final, highly provocative thought that the analysts and the sources presented, something I want to leave you to deeply mull over. The explicitly stated strategic goal of this war, from the perspective of the U.S. and Israel, was to secure the Middle East, neutralize the Iranian nuclear and military threat, and project unquestionable Western strength.
But in the brutal mathematics of war, the enemy always gets a vote, and the long-term outcomes rarely align with what the initial architects intended. Consider the broader historical trajectory we've discussed today.
What if the ultimate unintended consequence of this massive kinetic conflict is not the fall of the Iranian regime at all?
What if the regime survives, battered, decentralized, but structurally unbroken, while the unbearable economic and diplomatic fallout results in the permanent requested eviction of the United States from the Persian Gulf? If the host nations in the Gulf demand that the U.S. withdraw its bases to spare their cities from drone strikes, it leaves a historic, gaping power vacuum in the energy center of the world.
And as we establish, that vacuum will not remain empty. It will be filled almost instantly by nations from the East, China, Russia, and India. The war intended to cement American dominance and secure the region might be the precise catalyst that permanently ends Western influence in the Middle East.
It is the ultimate paradox of military intervention.
It all circles back to that primal physical reaction we talked about at the beginning. When a chokehold is finally released, the body doesn't just instantly snap back to its previous state of normalcy. Blood vessels are broken. The brain has been deprived of oxygen. Trauma changes the system. The global economy and the geopolitical order are holding their breath right now. But whenever this crisis finally ends and the system exhales, it is going to be breathing in a completely unrecognizable world.
A new architecture where the old rules of superpower leverage and maritime security simply no longer apply.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the sources. The news cycle is moving at blinding speed, the economic impacts are accelerating, and the partisan narratives are only going to get louder and more confusing in the coming weeks. Keep questioning what you see. Keep looking for the underlying logistical mechanics of how these global events directly affect your daily life, and stay fiercely curious. We'll be right here to help you unpack whatever comes next.